Hello, YouTube. In this stream today, me and my dad over here will primarily be talking about books, and then we might end up talking about other things depending on where the conversation ends up going. But to start things off, Dad, go ahead and say a book that you enjoy.
Well, the one that I've recently read is called A Man Called Uvi. It's written by a Swedish author by the name of Frederick Backman, Bachmann. It spent 42 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. It's a great book. It's a story about a man who, at the beginning of the book, wants to end his life, and by the end of the book, finds meaning. Um, it's a great book.
Absolutely. He loses his wife, and then he thinks that there's nothing for me after this tragic event. There's nothing left for me in life. So, what reason do I have to continue to live? But then he meets some new people, forms some new relationships that give him meaning, as Dad was just saying. Another way I would phrase it is that it gives him a reason to live again, a reason to keep going. In fact, this book has been adapted into a movie two different times. A Swedish film was made about a Swedish film was made that's an adaptation of the book, and then an American film was made this year that was an adaptation of the book. The American film is called A Man Called Otto. I actually watched that movie in theaters with my mom and a friend of mine named Eliza. We all really enjoyed it. In fact, Mia and Dad are going to be watching that movie today at the theater here in Montevideo. We're both really looking forward to it, Dad. Isn't that right?
Yeah, yeah. I've been wanting to see this movie for a long time.
Yeah, he's read the book, and so obviously he's going to be comparing it to the book. I have no doubt about that. This is very much a heartfelt, heartwarming, feel good kind of movie that's rather simple and straightforward. I thought it was a great movie. Also, me and him watched the movie Where the Crawdads Sing, which is also based on a book that he's read before. Isn't that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think of that book? Where the
What?
Crawdads?
Where the Crawdads Sing?
Yeah.
That was a great book. It's a mystery. It's kind of two stories. One is the story of this gal named Kyra who grows up in the marsh of I believe it's North Carolina, and she grows up on her own. Her parents both leave her when she's little, and so she grows up on her own. So it's her story of growing up in the marsh and learning about the marsh and learning all the animals of the marsh. And then it's a second story where she's charged with a crime, and it's the courtroom drama of her being tried for the crime.
The big question is, did she actually do what she's being accused of? And related to that, who actually did kill this guy who is the reason why Kira's on trial? Me, Dad, and Mom really enjoyed that movie. We actually watched it in theaters, and then afterwards we saw it at home.
No, we never saw it in theaters. It never came out in the theater. We saw it twice at home. At Russ and Judy's twice.
Ah, I see. All right, I forgot that we hadn't seen it in theaters.
Yeah, it never came out as a movie in the theater.
Yeah. A Man Called Otto stars Tom Hanks as Otto Anderson. He's a great actor who has starred
Excuse me for a second.
Who has starred in a lot of different films. He obviously plays the character of Woody in the Toy Story films. He also is the main character in the classic movie Forrest Gump. He starred in the movie The Green Mile, which came out back in the 90s. He starred in the movie Captain Phillips, along with the movie A League of Their Own, which is a sports film that came out back in the 90s. I watched that film fairly recently. The Swedish film based on the book A Man Called Uvi came out in 2015. And then the American film adaptation came out January 13th of this year. So not too long ago. I mean, exactly a month ago from today. So me and him are both really looking forward to watching it. And then when it comes to movies that are based on a book, me and him both watched the movie The House of Gucci. We saw that in theaters together. Really enjoyed it. Wouldn't you agree?
That was a good movie. Was that
Yeah.
based on a book?
Yeah, it is actually based on a book.
I didn't know that.
In that, in this case, you haven't read the book.
No, I
Unlike,
haven't.
yeah, but the book is called. Let's see, I'm looking it up right now. It came out back in like 2001. I'm pretty sure. The movie House of Gucci stars Lady Gaga as Patricia Reggiani. I haven't seen her in very many other movies. I thought that she gave a great performance in that movie. It also stars Jared Leto along with Adam Driver. And it stars Al Pacino, who's a very famous actor. The film is directed by Ridley Scott, who's made some great movies. He's the guy who directed the first Alien film that came out in 1978. That's a classic, and it's one of my favorite horror films, a genre that I'm in general not too much into. Also, House of Gucci stars Jeremy Irons, who's also a good actor. Ridley Scott also directed the movie The Martian, which is a great movie. The book that the movie's based on came out in 2001. It's called The House of Gucci, a sensational story of murder, madness, glamour, and greed. It was written by author Sarah Gay Forden. This is a story about the Italian fashion brand Gucci and the Gucci family. This is a sad and tragic story because what it's about is a family that ultimately destroys themselves because of their own selfishness. You remember that, right?
Mhm.
It's a story about what happens when pure selfishness takes over. Because over time, the members of the Gucci family become more and more obsessed with seeing the company be successful and prosper. And so what that leads to is them more and more looking at other members of the family as a hindrance, a liability. And so this leads to them betraying and backstabbing each other, leads to them being paranoid and mistrustful of each other, suspicious of everyone else. And
Yeah, that's true.
ultimately, I'm pretty sure I remember Patricia ends up orchestrating the murder of her own husband because of that selfishness. It's about a family that's consumed and ultimately destroyed by this one huge character flaw. It's a very powerful story. Now I can't say that this movie is particularly fun or entertaining. It's not meant to be, so it's not a bad thing, but it's just something to know going in.
It's pretty intense.
Yeah, there are definitely other movies that I find more rewatchable because they're more fun or entertaining. But this movie does have great performances, a very well told story. Those are the main two things I'd say the movie does well. Also, The Client is a book written by John Grisham that was also adapted into a movie. We've both seen the movie and we both read the book. In fact, I remember years ago when you and me used to read books to each other, we read The Client.
Did we?
Yeah, we
I've
did.
forgotten that.
Yeah, we did. This story is a thriller about a little kid, a 11-year old boy along with his brother who by complete chance stumble into this this war, this conflict between the mafia and law enforcement.
They witness a suicide,
Indeed.
and that ends up involving the mafia.
And the
The
FBI.
person who died was involved with the mafia.
Yeah, he was a lawyer who was involved with the mafia. He tells the main character Mark Sway this huge secret that both the mafia and the FBI really want to know. And so in this story, Mark Sway is put in this really bad situation because he doesn't have very many people that he can rely on. His life is in jeopardy. He ends up being thrown in jail, even though technically speaking, he's only detained for his own safety.
It's called protective custody.
Yeah, he's put into protective custody. He's not literally put in jail, but from his perspective, that's what it feels like. He's not thinking that, oh, this is for my own safety. He sees it as I'm being thrown in jail. He's put on trial, and his little brother, is so traumatized by what he saw, a man killing himself, that he is in like a catatonic state where he's not moving much, not saying much, in a hospital bed. And the mother is in a really tough situation as well because of what her two boys are going through, and she's under a lot of stress. It's a very good story. Another example would be Phantom of the Opera. We specifically watched the 2004 film adaptation. It stars Gerald Butler as the Phantom, Emmy Rossum as Christine, and Patrick Wilson as Raoul. The book that started off all this, that all the films are based on, came out a long time ago. It's written by French author Gaston Delerue. I've read it before. In fact, me and him have actually read that book before as well.
Did we?
Yeah, there have been a good amount of film adaptations that have been made of this story, including some ones that go pretty far back, like back to the 1920s. One of the more famous ones is the film adaptation that starred. I'm trying to think of who the actor's name is. I'm blanking right now. But in addition to being adapted into film several times, this story also was turned into a Broadway musical, which is also what the 2004 film adaptation is based on. And it's based on both the Broadway musical along with the original book. In fact, I actually have the original book along with me, so I'll be getting that momentarily. But also, you and me have both watched the movie Conspiracy Theory. Remember that one?
Yeah, I do.
That
Mel Gibson. That's one of my all-time favorite movies. Starred Mel Gibson and Julia Roberts.
Yeah, it stars some rather famous actors. The main character is this guy who believes in all these conspiracy theories. So most people write him off as just a nutball, or like, this guy's crazy. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So like, no one takes him seriously. But he ends up being right. And it turns out that he was involved in this whole plot that involved the government, them doing shady things in secret. To a certain degree, the story is actually based off of true events because of this plot that ended up happening called Malcolm X. I'm pretty sure that's what the name. Pretty sure that's a name, but it's a really good film that came out back in 1997, and I don't remember when the book came out. Also, the movie stars Patrick Stewart as his government official. He's also quite a famous actor. And it's also the movie Pelican Brief. Remember that?
Yeah, I do. That's another John Grisham. John Grisham has written so many books. It's crazy, and they're all courtroom dramas.
Yeah, are there other John Grisham books you've read?
I don't think I've read them, but we've seen other movies by him. We saw a movie called Rainmaker.
Yeah, that's
Rainmaker.
Yeah.
We saw another one called Runaway Jury.
Yeah, it's been a good amount
About
of time.
jury tampering.
Yeah, that's right. It's been a good amount of time since I've watched Runaway Jury. I don't really remember the specifics of that movie as much. I remember generally what happens. When it comes to Rainmaker, that's a story about this young greenhorn attorney who went to law school, and actually during the story he passes his bar exam. Therefore, he becomes an actual lawyer, and then he ends up participating in this high profile case involving a big insurance company. What that means is that he's facing off against seasoned, experienced, and very well paid attorneys.
As a young lawyer.
Yeah, he actually tries his first case in this story. He's going up against this big insurance company that has a lot of resources at its disposal. So he's definitely the underdog in this story. There's no doubt about that. But he ends up coming up on top. It's great. It's a great example of a David versus Goliath story. It's a really good story. I haven't personally read the book that The Rainmaker is based on. I've just seen the movie. Same thing goes with Pelican Brief as well. In fact, and actually, when it comes to books that I've personally read, I'm going to show this one right here. Ready Player One is a book that I've read before. It was also adapted into a film. This story is set in the year 2044, where reality is an ugly place. As the back of the book flat out says, the world is not in a particularly good place. Therefore, a lot of people, in order to escape from the harsh realities of life, have turned to this VR this VR utopia called the Oasis. People have become very much hooked with the Oasis, and the guy who originally created this whole VR system, a very smart guy, but also very socially awkward. He created this whole puzzle, this big elaborate puzzle for people to solve. People have been hunting for this one big Easter egg for a long time. The main character is a teenager named Wade Watts. He ends up going on the quest to find the Easter egg. He ends up finding it, and therefore everything in his life changes for the better. This book is written by Ernest Cline. I've also watched the movie as well. I haven't read Ready Player 2, which is the sequel to this book. I've just read the first book. The movie is actually directed by Steven Spielberg. Dad, I don't think you're going to be able to get the cats, frankly. That's unfortunate, but I just don't think it's actually. I don't think it's actually going to happen. I'm going to get a few books here so I can show them. So this right here is a book I've read before, The Case for Christ, written by Lee Strobel. Dad, are you going to?
Yeah, I'm coming.
Help. So this book right here is one that Lee Strobel wrote because he interviewed a whole bunch of different people to try to figure out whether the evidence for Jesus Christ is valid and reliable.
He actually started out, his goal was to disprove Christianity. And he ended up proving it.
Indeed, he was an atheist who is his wife. He was an atheist. His wife ended up becoming a Christian. He at first was not a fan of that, and so he did this big investigation to disprove Christianity. But instead, the exact opposite ended up happening. He ended up becoming a Christian. He was baptized and even became a pastor as well. And it's really interesting when you read this book how the evidence really does stand up. So, one of the things that this book talks about is the fact that with a lot of ancient writings, with some pretty famous ancient writings at that, like the Homer or the Iliad, there aren't a ton of copies left of those ancient writings, whereas there are a ton of New Testament manuscripts that still are around. I mean, there are thousands of them.
Yeah.
Compared to famous ancient writings that historians absolutely consider to be reliable, like the Homer, the Iliad, other works from the Greeks, other ancient people as well, where there's a lot less evidence when it comes to physical manuscripts. Also, this book talks about the fact that when it comes to the famous Alexander the Great, when you look at the writings that talk about Alexander the Great, they didn't pop up until a long time after until his death.
A long time after his death.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what I said. Yeah, but yet, despite that, no historian would ever say that like Alexander the Great didn't exist. Whereas with Jesus, there's evidence of him being on Earth that goes back to shortly after he was on Earth. So
Right.
there's a big difference there.
Mhm.
This book also goes into places that are mentioned. Actually, yeah, I'll show you what I'm talking about right here. So look at that. It talks about places that are mentioned in the Bible. I don't know how well you would. I don't know how well other people would be able to see this on camera. It's
You can't see that.
okay. Yeah, it's unfortunately you can't really see it well.
It's talking
on
about
camera.
a place called Abilene, spelled Abilene.
Yeah, that's an example of what this book talks about. It goes into different places, either like cities or towns or specific landmarks that are mentioned in the Gospels. And Lee Strobel is digging into the question of, does scientific evidence that's found via archaeology, back up these mentions? And what he finds is that yes, they do in fact corroborate what's stated in the Gospels. When you read this book, it's pretty in depth. The movie does a good job as well. It basically hits the most important parts. It hits the major bullet points, but the book, obviously, as you can imagine, goes into more detail. It's really quite fascinating. Also, got right here this book, Pillars of the Earth, written by author Ken Follett. It's a book you've read before, and this is a book that I've read before as well. I read this back when I was a college student.
You read it because I recommended it to you.
Yeah, that is true. When I was a college student, I read it. I actually read it over several months, and I read it slowly. I would read little chunks of the book at a time. It's a long book. It's It's almost 1,000 pages long, and it's not always easy to read because it can be violent at times and even sexual at times. So it's not always the easiest book to read. In fact, this is not one I would recommend for young people. It's definitely a more mature book for an older audience.
It's for
I think
adults, sure.
yeah, I think you agree with that. It's very well written, but it's definitely an adult book. Me and him also played before the board game that's actually based on this book. It's one of the strategy games that we really enjoy playing. We've owned it for years. Back in New York, there was this place called the Richmond Memorial Library that me and him used to go to. You remember that place,
I
right?
do, yeah.
Yeah, that library was unique because they had board and card games on the shelves in stock that you could rent. That's not common for a library. And I've been to several other libraries before, like the one here in Montevideo. There's one back in New York, one in Bergen specifically, where we actually lived in. Those libraries do not have border card games that you can actually rent. I know also there is a sequel to this book um, called War. Yeah, I think it's a sequel called World Without End. Um,
Yeah, that's
you-
right. I've read that one too. It's not as good.
ah,
I don't think it's as good.
I see. So on top of the fact that there's a board game that was made that's based on this book, there's also a TV miniseries that was made that's based on this book as well. In fact, you and me actually watched that TV miniseries years ago.
I don't know
when
if
we
I
were-
ever watched it.
I know. I remember watching it with you
Really?
because I remember us talking about it
Oh,
because of because of the political intrigue that's present in the story. I mean, I think a good way to summarize what this story is about is it's about the royal court, political intrigue, the dynamic and even tension between the political authorities and the religious authorities. It's about this guy who's trying to get this big cathedral built, but he faces a lot of obstacles on the way to actually achieving that.
right.
You know what I mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
That makes the story similar to the show Game of Thrones, even though it's not a series that I've actually watched before. I know just from what I've heard that's also like based on the royal court political intrigue. I think it does have like dragons in it, so it's not exactly the same as Pillars of the Earth, but you can definitely see the similarities there. Just also a more grown up, mature story that's definitely aimed for adults, not for kids. Also, back when we actually did read books together, you and me read the first Harry Potter book together.
Did we?
Yeah, I actually still own the 7 main Harry Potter books. In fact, I actually brought them along with me. And then you and me watched Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them in theaters a couple of years back.
That's right.
Yeah, that movie like came out I'm pretty sure in 2016. You and me were both in the cities together when we saw it. Now, actually, why don't you go ahead and talk about some historical books you've read before?
Well, I'll go back to this one, Pillars of the Earth. What's interesting is that the violence didn't bother me as a reader, and he's been criticized for some of the sexual violence in the book, which some of the scenes are fairly graphic, which some have argued was unnecessary, but I feel like the violence was typical of life in the Middle Ages. It wasn't violence for violence's sake. So, for example, the Friday the 13th movies were horror, and they were violence for violence sake. They were just gratifying violence, which is why I won't watch them. But this book was just realistically describing how women were treated in the Middle Ages, which was often in a very negative way as sex objects, kind of to be used by men for their convenience and pleasure. So
Indeed.
the violence didn't bother me.
Indeed, that is true. The world back then was quite different to how it is today. In fact, another reason why I know that is because I've watched the series The Last Kingdom before, which is also actually based on a book. I think it's based on multiple books. It's based on a it's based on a series of British books. The Last Kingdom is a British TV series that's on Netflix. It first started in 2015. First episode came out October 10th, 2015. There's 5 seasons of the show, and it's adapted from the Saxon Stories, which is a historical novel series that was written by author Bernard Cornwell about the birth of England in the 9th and 10th centuries. There's 13 novels that he wrote that are part of this series. The main character or protagonist of the series is called Uhtred of Bedenberg. He was born to a Saxon lord in Northumbria, but was captured as a child and raised by a Danish warlord. Now, for a little bit of context, back then, Saxons were the Christians, Danes were the non-Christians. There was a lot of tension between those two groups because the Saxons oftentimes looked down on the Danes as just being savages, primitives, barbarians, whatever word you want to use. Uhtred was someone who was biologically a Saxon. He was born a Saxon, born a Christian, basically, but he was raised by non-Christians. So therefore, he was a part of both worlds. Now, again, back to a question I was originally asking: what are some other historical novels that you read before? Remember how you talked about those back when we tried to do the stream that last time? Like novels about different wars.
Oh, okay. Well, I read it's called the Century Trilogy. It's also by the same author, Ken Follett. And what's interesting is Ken Follett made early in his writing career, he wrote spy novels set in World War II. So kind of Raiders of the Lost Ark style spy novels set in World War II. And then, so that was historical fiction. And then historical fiction. But then he kind of switched, and these were all short novels. One was called The Eye of the Needle. Another one was called The Key to Rebecca, which The Key to Rebecca, I believe, was made into a motion picture. I never saw that one. But these were short novels, and they were not really based on, well, in some cases, like Eye of the Needle, or one of those two was based on Rommel, Erwin Rommel, who was a German general during World War II. He fought in Africa, North Africa. But then he switched to these big books, really thick books, and he wrote something called the Century Trilogy, which I've read. I've read it more than once. I can't remember if I've read the whole series more than once. I think I have. I think I've read the whole series twice. And these books are about 1,000 each, 1,000 pages each, so they're huge books. And they developed a story of interrelated families. And the book starts in World War I, and it ends after the Civil Rights Movement in the United States. And it tracks these interrelated families. So, for example, one family, the brother and sister end up on two different sides of the Cold War, one fighting for the Soviet Union and one working for the administration of JFK. And it's just a fascinating series.
That is really interesting.
And there's 3 books in this. That's why it's called the Century Trilogy. They've all been bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers, I believe.
That is really fascinating because you can imagine how much tension there would be as a result of being on 2 different sides of the Cold War. Because while during the time of the Cold War, there was not open warfare between the US and the Soviet Union on the battlefield, the 2 sides are still battling each other just in different ways. it was an ideological conflict.
Well, but there were battles, the Vietnam War and
Yeah,
the Korean War.
Yes,
were both-
I know that, Dad. But
Cold
however,
War.
what I said exactly is there's not open warfare on the battlefield between the United States
And
and the Soviet Union directly.
True.
They fought each other indirectly through
Mhm.
proxy wars. That's the term that's been used to refer to the Vietnam War and the Korean War.
Oh,
Because in those cases, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were basically the puppet masters behind the scenes
right.
that were controlling one of the sides of each conflict. So in reality, it was the U.S. and the Soviet Union battling each other, just not directly. And then when it comes to the Vietnam War, unfortunately, it caused a lot of division and polarization in the United States. Because you had the Doves and the Hawks, there was a lot of instability with all the riots that happened. And then there were things that happened during the Vietnam War that made the American people distrust the government, like what happened with Cambodia, where it was discovered that President Nixon had secretly sent American soldiers to Cambodia without notifying either Congress or the American people. Also, there's the incident with Tonkin Gulf, where the Tonkin Gulf papers were released by a journalist. They exposed how the government wasn't completely honest with the American people when it came to why the US got involved in the Vietnam War. And yeah, so the thing is that originally it was claimed that North Vietnam initiated initiated two different attacks that happened. One was on August 2nd, 1964. The other one was August 4th, 1964. But then after the fact, it was discovered because of the Tonkin Gulf papers that this supposed second attack never actually happened. They then obviously had the whole Watergate scandal, which, as you can imagine, also caused people to not trust the government anymore. So, man, when it comes to interrelated families during all these major world events that obviously had major ramifications, I mean, that would be tough on a family. There's no doubt about that. And then when it comes to other books I've read before, one is called The Hot Zone. It was written by author Richard Preston. It's based on a true story, and in fact, this book was adapted into a TV series that first came out just a couple of years back. Let's see, the series is on Hulu. The first episode came out May 27th, 2019. I'm talking right now about this book right here,
Oh, okay.
The Hot Zone. It's a true story, and it was turned into a TV series. Two episodes, a 2-season long series. It's currently on Hulu. First episode came out May 27th, 2019. This story is about an incident that happened in 1989 when chimpanzees that were in a research lab that was located in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., were found to have the Ebola virus within them. This is a very scary virus because it can spread really fast. And therefore, as you can imagine, there was a lot of concern among both the government and the army that a outbreak could occur. All right, I'll keep going. There's a lot of fear that the Ebola virus could spread. Fortunately, that did not actually end up happening, but it was a close call. So this happened during the winter of 1989 at an Army research facility that was right outside Washington, D.C., so not far at all from the capital of the United States. This operation happened for 18 days. It was a secret. The conditions were dangerous, and there was no precedent. I've read the book before. It's very interesting, and the book starts off by relaying all these stories about the Ebola virus in Africa, and then it transitions to the U.S. The main character is this U.S. Army scientist who works hard to make sure that an outbreak does not occur. This TV series, The Hot Zone, originally aired on National Geographic before it ended up moving to Hulu. Let's see. So this U.S. Army scientist I mentioned before is named Colonel Nancy Jakes, JAAX, an Army veterinary pathologist. And her husband Jerry is an Army veterinary surgeon. One of the other characters named is Dr. Peter Jarling, who's a virologist. I watched that series several years back with my mom. I don't know if we ended up watching season 2, but we definitely ended up watching season 1. Yeah, this cat you're seeing right here is named Toby. Huh. You're a good boy, aren't you, buddy? Hey, smile for the camera, huh? Yeah, he's a big boy, as you can tell. Yeah. So right here, actually, this is the book I mentioned earlier, Conspiracy Theory. That's a really good book. The main character is named Jerry Fletcher. He's a New York cab driver obsessed with conspiracy theories, as I mentioned before. And then you have Alice Sutton, who's a Justice Department attorney, who at first, as you can imagine, because she bases a lot of her decisions on logic and reason, finds him to just be a crazy guy who doesn't know what he's talking about. But then Jerry ends up being abducted, tortured, barely even escapes of his life. And therefore, she ends up believing him. In fact, the two of them are pursued by both the CIA the FBI, and a mysterious nemesis who calls himself Dr. Jones. Yeah, I'm reading this here from the back of the book right here, which gives a little description. Also, here's another book I've read before, Rebel with a Cause. This right here is an autobiography about Franklin Graham, who is the son of the famous speaker Billy Graham, who
Right.
you definitely know about.
Yep, and Franklin Graham is in charge of a Christian organization called Samaritan's Purse.
I've gone on mission trips before for Samaritan's Purse,
Right.
2 times actually, when I was a college student. I had a great time. For one, we helped with rebuilding homes. That was the good work that we ended up doing. And then we also did a good amount of fun things as well, like paintball, going to a ropes course, going to a zoo, doing an escape room. It was a great time. But this is a really good autobiography. It's a really interesting story.
Sean, we're going to have to end this call pretty quick because Mom needs us to bring her lunch.
No, what time?
So,
What time is?
well, we need to leave pretty quick.
When?
So pretty quick. So I'm going to show a couple more of my books.
Yeah, go ahead and do that. Yeah, my dad really likes coloring books, alongside novels, of course. He also really enjoys doing dot to dot. Doing dot to dots. He's kind of creative exercises.
So there is a Roman ship, a Phoenician ship that I did. This is a truck, a Kenworth truck. Here's a fisherman, a trout. I don't know what kind of fisherman, but he's obviously catching a very large fish. And the challenge with this is connecting the dots. So if you remember when you were a kid, you did these dot to dots. Well, I do big dot to dots. So these are fairly easy. These are 300 to 400 dots per one. This is the St. Petersburg Cathedral. So there's buildings in here.
There's a lot of dot to dots in there, and good amount of them he's done. He really likes doing these kind of creative activities.
Dancer. Here's a this one I remember doing because it was so creepy to do it. This is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And I remember drawing the gun and having it pointed at Lincoln's head. That was kind of creepy. That was kind of hard to do. I've also done military figures. So here's a poster called Uncle Sam Wants You that was used during World War II. Here's a plane of some kind. I think that's a German jet plane. I believe it was called the Me-262. It was one of the first jet planes ever made. It was made by Germany.
And
here's a tank. This is can't remember which tank that is. And then I've also done cities.
One thing that's major about World War I is that was the first time that tanks actually were used on the battlefield.
True. This is Chicago. That's the Bean in Chicago. And then
we've been to Chicago before. It's a good place to be.
This is Dubai. That's a skyscraper. And then this is Hong Kong. There's a skyscraper and a mountain and a ship that you can see. These are 1,000 dots each. So, Sean, we got to wrap up.
In that case, I'm going to wrap up by saying this. Right, first, actually, just quickly, this right here is that Pillars of the Earth TV miniseries that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I remember.
This is set for it. And right here, you have this book called The Shack, written by William P. Young. Me and him have watched the movie The Shack, and I've read the book. It's a really interesting story because you have this guy, Mackenzie Allen Phillips. He and his family go on a vacation that at first they think is obviously going to be a good standard vacation. Then their youngest daughter, Missy, ends up being abducted. Because of this tragic event, Mackenzie ends up losing his faith because obviously he's thinking, God, where were you when Missy needed you? Why did this happen? Why did you allow this to happen? If you're truly good and truly love me, why did you allow such a terrible thing to happen to an innocent little girl who did nothing wrong? But then, 4 years after this tragic event, he receives this suspicious note that sends him on this journey where he goes to this cabin where he actually meets God, meets the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He literally physically sees them. At least that's what he said he saw. There's not video footage out there that literally shows this is what happened. So whether you personally believe that this is what actually happened to him or not is obviously up to you.
Well, it's a work of fiction. The author never claims that it actually happened. It's a work of fiction.
Well, it pretty sure is big.
So we got to wrap up.
Okay, yeah, I'm just pretty sure I remember it's based on a true story. But yeah, he basically Mackenzie has this whole experience where he he meets God in person, and it completely changes his. It completely changes him to where he regains his faith again. So it's a very powerful story. But with that being said, however, that is going to be it for today. Though I will be doing streams in the future, I'm still going to be posting videos as I've been doing. So now we're going to end the stream for today.
Yep.
So I
Thank
think
you.
that you would agree that we had a good time, right?
Yeah, we did.
All right. So goodbye. Sayonara.